Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, Version Control Meets Data Control. I'm really glad you all showed up. We will start in about a minute. In the meantime, I wanted to talk about the presenters of today's webinar. We have Kyle Haley. Kyle is a technical evangelist at Delphix. He's also an Oracle Ace and a member of the Oak Table Network. And from DBmaestro, we have Uri. Uri is our Director of Product Management and a well-known presenter at global conferences. And I'm sure that you will have a lot of fun with them in the next hour or so. Just a few technical notes before we start the presentation. You will be put on mute throughout the whole session. If you, for some reason, can't hear us, because I'm talking now, obviously, then type a message in the question box so we know. But in any case, you should check your control panel to see if everything is working properly on your side. Uri and Kyle will do the presentation, and we will do a Q&A part at the end. If you have any questions throughout the session, just type them in the question bar, and we will address each and every one of them at the end. And early next week, there will be an online version of the webinar. You will be able to download and watch it again, and we will post that on the website. So Uri and Kyle will take it from here. Bye-bye.
Hi, my name is Kyle Haley, and I work for Delphix. Delphix is a software company. It was founded in 2008, and we launched our first product in 2010. Our CEO is Jed Yue, who's also known as the founder of Avamar, which is over a $1 billion company revenue a year that he sold to EMC. Delphix is based in Silicon Valley with global operations. It's used by 10% of the Fortune 500, and it is growing at almost 300% a year. And so you might recognize some of our current customers here on the slide.
Thank you, Kyle. A few words on DBmaestro. Hello, everyone. This is Uri. DBmaestro founded in 2008, added by Yariv Tabak and Yaniv Yehuda, two IT professionals, people from Israel. DBmaestro is part of the Extreme Group, which has about 180 IT professional consultants, giving consultants to large organizations in Israel and worldwide. You can see some of the customers of DBmaestro here in this slide. So the topic of today's webinar is how you can have your database development under version control principles and methods to catch up with your application development, and how you can utilize the database virtualization in order to clone your database for parallel development. From the business point of view, we would like to have system updated with no time. But surveys shows that 80% of unplanned downtime is due to change. And of course, this impacts mission-critical services. From the 80%, more than 50% are due to human errors. People forget to do stuff. People forget to promote stuff. Syntax error on the scripts they promote in the production. And in addition to all of this, about 40% of all changes do fail. Of course, this sums into many hours in which the systems are down and reflect the business availability. If we look on the technology need, then of course everyone doesn't want to do repeated tasks over and over again. It's developer, DBAs, IT professional. We want to do it once, and we want to do it, of course, correctly the first time. But we need to remember, we need a system that helps us to remember what changes we've done in the last 6 months or the last couple of weeks. because we are on high pressure. And of course, because of the agile world we exist in today's market, we need to do it very soon, very often. We need to promote changes to production, to the operation very quickly, and of course this required automation. And we don't want to repeat ourselves. We don't want human error and syntax error. So in software development, you cannot talk on automation and not mention agile and DevOps, the two high buzzwords in the market today. So how we deal with the risk of changes? In development, we release smaller and more focused changes, while we believe they are easier to manage. We do it often, so we must have some automation. Otherwise, we will repeat tasks over and over again. And of course, we don't want it because we want to be productive, and we don't want human error in our scenarios. This, of course, called agile. But so far, we were doing stuff internally, only in the development. And when we work to operation, we want it to be smoothly. But operation, they want the environments be stable, less changes, not very often to promote changes. So this comes into DevOps, to bring between the development and the operation to be on the same team. So we can promote changes quickly to operation, so the business will leverage our development and extend the business profit. Source control solutions are now standard de facto. No one today thinks on developing software without having any version control solution that will manage the changes, keep track on the history. But when considering the version control solution, small but critical tier in the application is left aside. Of course, I mean the database. And what we will show right now is how you can leverage the database and add it into your application development methods. Now, database is also part of the application code. It can be in several ways: schema structure, business code written in PL/SQL, and reference data in lookup table. The main reasons why database code is not native to traditional file-based version control are that database is a central resource. Objects within the database cannot be dropped and created as we do to source code or as we do to executables when we deploy them. This brings us to a big challenge. How can we branch a database or clone it easily in order to be more agile? With this question in mind, I'll pass the control to Kyle so he can show you how we can do it. Kyle, go ahead. Kyle, I think there is an issue with your audio.
Yes, sorry about that. So here's a cycle that you might be familiar with that we've seen in the industry, where IT department budgets are being constrained. And when IT budgets are constrained, one of the first targets is reducing storage. As storage budgets are reduced, the ability to create database copies and provision development environments goes down. As development environments become constrained, projects start to hit delays. As projects are delayed, the applications that the business depends on to generate revenue are delayed, which reduces revenue as the business cannot access new applications, which in turn puts more pressure on the IT budget, and it becomes a vicious circle. There's a saying in the industry that we want good, cheap, fast, choose two, meaning we want to build applications quickly, i.e. fast. We want those applications to have good functionality, and we want those applications to be cheap to build. but we can't have all three. So I don't know if the situations on this slide ring a bell at your organization, or if you can imagine some of these situations. But here are some of the issues we at Delphix are seeing in the industry with the companies we're talking to. We're seeing inefficient QA causing higher costs of QA. We're seeing QA delays, which cause greater rework of code. We're seeing sharing database environments in development causing development coding bottlenecks. We're seeing using database subsets, which ends up creating more bugs in production. And we're seeing slow environment builds, which is creating project delays. So let's quickly look at these 5 points in a little more detail. The first one is inefficient QA, or long build times for QA environments. We talked to Presbyterian Healthcare, and they told us that they spend 96% of their QA cycle time building the QA environment, and only 4% actually running the QA suite. And this happens for every QA suite, meaning that for every dollar spent on QA, there was only 4 cents of actual QA value, and that 96% of the cost is spent on infrastructure and overhead. The second thing that we're seeing is QA delays, which means bugs are found late and require more rework, more code rework. Because of the time required to set up QA environments, the actual QA test suites lag behind the end of a sprint or a code freeze, meaning that the amount of time that goes by after the introduction of a bug into code and before the bug is found increases. And the more time that goes by after the introduction of a bug into the code, the more dependent code is written on top of the bug, increasing the amount of code rework required after the bug is finally found. In a seminal book that some of you may be familiar with, called Software Engineering Economics, the author Barry Boehm introduced the computer world to the idea that the longer one delays in fixing a bug in the software development lifecycle, the more expensive it is to fix that bug, and these costs rise exponentially as the delays increase. The third thing we see is sharing full copies of a database across a development team. And I'm not sure if you've run into this, but I've personally experienced with the following. When I was talking to one group at eBay, in that development group, they shared a single copy of the production database between the developers on that team. What the sharing of a single copy of production meant is that whenever a developer wanted to modify that database, they had to submit their changes to code review, and that code review took 1 to 2 weeks. And I don't know about you, but if I was a developer, that would stifle my motivation. And this disgruntlement by developers is something I've had direct experience with. The last time I was a DBA, all the schema changes on the development database went through me. I had to apply those changes. And I could do them pretty quickly. I'd get them done probably in half a day. But even that half a day delay caused so much frustration in development that the developers unilaterally decided to go to a EAV schema. And EAV stands for Entity Attribute Value Schema, which means that developers could add new fields without consulting me or without stepping on each other's feet. It also means that SQL code was unreadable and the performance was atrocious. And besides these delays causing developer frustrations, sharing a single database also means refreshing the data is difficult, as it takes a while to refresh the full copy.
The guy who's presenting with Roy from Delphix.
And it takes even longer to coordinate a time when everyone's stops using the copy to make a refresh. All this means is that the copy rarely gets refreshed and the data gets old and unreliable. The fourth thing that we see is, as a way to circumvent the problems of sharing a single copy of production, many shops we talk to create subsets. One copy we talked to, Royal Bank of Scotland, says they spend 50% of their DBA time copying databases, but they don't have enough resources to make full copies, so they create subsets. But creating the subsets requires some complex scripting to ensure that we extract a coherent set of data, a small coherent set of data from production, and that this data respects things like referential integrity. And they're finding that these scripts are constantly breaking, require more time to rework them. Now the question arises, if development and QA are working on small subset copies of production, what happens when that code actually hits the full development size database? Often that code hits the wall. And this can happen for a number of reasons. One, queries that might have run fast on small subsets now run slow on the production sizes. And also the production data ranges might hit anomalies in the code that the code had not hit in the subset databases. One company we talked to, which is part of eBay, called StubHub, estimates that 20% of the production bugs arise from testing on subsets instead of full database copies. And finally, the last point that we see quite often is slow environment builds. And now, the biggest and most pervasive problem in the industry that we see is these slow build times. In order to set up a database copy for a development environment, it requires submitting a request to management, who has to review it, and if the request is granted, it's passed to a DBA, who has to coordinate with the sysadmin, who has to coordinate with the storage admin. In such a situation, it makes sense that copying a large database would take a long time. But even when we talk to someone who uses NetApp storage snapshots like Electronic Arts or Ariba, they say that using storage snapshots still takes them days to weeks to get a database clone copy due to all these coordination between DBA, sysadmins, and storage admins. At many of the customers we talk to, provisioning a database clone takes weeks or months. One large global bank quoted us as saying it typically takes them 6 months to provision a database clone copy environment. Just a sec, my PowerPoint went down. And because of these slow environment builds, this creates a culture of no. Due to the constraints of building clone copy database environments, one ends up with this culture of no, where developers stop asking for a copy of production databases because they know the answer is no. If the developers need to debug an anomaly seen on production, or if they need to write custom module requiring a copy of production, they know not to even ask, and they just give up. So just a review of what we've seen. We see inefficient QA, which causes higher costs. We see QA delays, which increase the amount of rework of code. We see sharing databases causing bottlenecks in development teams. We see using subsets databases causing bugs that hit production. And we see slow environment builds, which cause project delays. So now a quick poll. We're interested in hearing from you, which one of the following have you run into at your organization? Inefficient QA driving up costs, QA delay causing increased rework of code, sharing databases in development causing development bottlenecks, and using subset databases in development causing bugs in production, and slow environment builds causing project delays.
So Kyle, here are the results of the poll.
Okay. Shh. Are the poll results coming up on the screen?
Yes, just a second. Just a second, I will put it back on the screen. Can you see the polls in result in your screen?
I can see them on mine, yes.
Okay, so I changed you to be the presenter, and probably you can,
Okay.
anyone can see it. Okay, so you can say what the results of the poll, and then we can continue next.
So it looks across the polls that for most of these categories, over half of the attendees on this webinar run into these issues. The largest one being the sharing databases causes development bottlenecks at 70%. And then the next largest is the slow environment builds causing project delays.
Okay, Kyle, your screen.
Okay.
I don't think your screen is being shared, Kyle.
Okay. Is that showing?
No.
I'm not sure that I have presentation right now.
Let me just bring you back. Okay, you are the presenter.
Okay, so we've seen some of the issues that have come up in development environments. And it's interesting to read CIO Magazine, who did a recent survey that says 60% of projects that they surveyed are over schedule and over budget. And of those projects, 85% of them are hitting those delays because of problems provisioning environments and database copies. So the problem is getting the right data to the right people at the right time, meaning data is the problem. But we can solve this data problem today using Delphix, and Delphix will unlock your data. So let's look at what's going on here. If we're provisioning environments, usually the long pole in provisioning those environments is creating copies of the production database, which can be large. But across all these clone copies used in different environments, 99% of the blocks are identical, and only a small portion is being changed by each clone. So a different approach to creating full copies is first sharing all the duplicate blocks that don't get modified across these clones, and keeping modified blocks private to the clones that made those modifications. This is where Delphix comes in. So Delphix is like similar to VMware, where VMware takes a single set of hardware and provisions many virtual machines. Delphix takes a single set of data files and provisions many what we call virtual databases. So before database virtualization, on the left, we have 3 physical copies of the same database. They all go to the same SAN, and in that SAN they each have their own full copies of that database. On the right, we have 3 virtual database copies. These databases come into Delphix, and Delphix orchestrates access to a SAN, and on that SAN there's actually just 1 copy of the database files. Those copies of database files can represent the files at different points in time, but all the duplicate blocks are shared, and Delphix orchestrates this access, and it's supported for SQL Server and Oracle. So Delphix is just software. It installs on any commodity Intel hardware. It supports Oracle 9.2 through 12c, Standard Edition, Enterprise Edition, Single Instance, and Rack on AX, Spark, HPUX, and Linux. It also supports SQL Server. We install Delphix on any commodity Intel hardware. And it installs as a VM. Once it's installed, we allocate storage. That storage can be anything, such as EMC, NetApp, Fujitsu, JBOD. And one of the most exciting things is that storage can be new flash arrays. So the flash market has a lot of contenders right now. It's not clear who the winner is going to be, but Delphix can take advantage of any of it. A recent benchmark with Pure Storage showed that for an order of magnitude less cost, one could have higher performance using a combination of Delphix and Pure Storage. So the way it works is we have once we install Delphix and allocate storage, we then register a source machine with Delphix. Delphix will find the databases on that machine and automatically, and at that time we can choose to link to one of those source databases. And at that point, Delphix takes a full copy of that source database. This is a one-time only event when we initially connect to that database. That database copy is typically compressed by 1/3. So if the original source database was 9 terabytes, the storage on Delphix would be 3 terabytes. Once we've done the initial link, from then on, Delphix collects incrementally and forever the changes on the source databases and saves them in a time window. Data that's no longer needed, older than that time window, is automatically purged. So but a typical architecture without database virtualization, we would have a production database, and then we have different environments like development, QA, user acceptance testing, that all have full physical copies of that database, which is inefficient and requires a lot of storage, time, and resources. With Delphix, we take that one initial copy, compress it, and then incrementally collect the changes. From that data source on Delphix, we can allocate in minutes copies, full copies to each of these environments and share all the duplicate blocks on Delphix. Here's the Delphix UI. I'm sort of proud of it. I'm very much a user interface person myself, and one of our customers said the Delphix GUI is what Oracle Enterprise Manager would look like if Apple had designed it. So the 3 core parts to Delphix that I want to go over. One important part is that initial linking to the production database. This linking pulls in forever and incrementally all the changes from the production database, keeps them compressed on Delphix. So the second step is Delphix, where we have the Delphix file system, or DXFS, which takes care of all the storage snapshots that allow sharing of duplicate blocks and orchestrating management to the change blocks, and also takes care of compression. The third part is automatic provisioning or self-service provisioning of clone copies to target machines. And what this allows us is full, fresh copies in minutes. So if I want to allocate a virtual database, within a few minutes I can spin up a full copy of the production database that's just a few minutes behind the production database. So it's fresh data and it's a full copy of the database. What this allows, because creating virtual databases is practically free, it's fast with almost no storage overhead, we can allocate as many copies as we want, which breaks through new ideas such as giving each developer their own copy of the production database, or they can code as fast as they want. And it allows new and innovative methods that are efficient, such as branching virtual databases. When a development team finishes a sprint, instead of having to create a full copy of that database for QA, we can in minutes simply branch off a copy of the development virtual database and create a QA virtual database. And the interface is simple. Within 4 clicks of a mouse, a user can provision their own clone copy of a database, allowing developers to provision their own virtual databases without going through the enormous bureaucracy of management chain and talking to DBAs, storage admins, and system admins. So what we've seen with Delphix, efficient QA, quick QA, every developer gets their own database copy, developers use full database copies, and they have fast builds. So for example, with Presbyterian Healthcare, they went from 10-hour builds down to 10-minute builds using Delphix. This meant that 99% of their time was now spent on QA cycle testing, and only 1% of the time was spent on the build of environments, leading to efficient QA and lower costs. Second, since it's now extremely fast to build the QA environment, when a sprint ends, we can branch a copy of the development database and environment and immediately start running QA, which means less dependent code is built upon bugs, and bugs can be fixed faster and cheaper. Third thing is we can give private copies, which means every developer can have their own copy, and even in QA, no longer are we constrained to running 1 or 2 QA suites at a time, but we can run many QA suites in parallel. For example, StubHub went from 5 copies per production in the development teams to 120 copies, so using the exact same hardware resources and the exact same Oracle licensing. The fourth thing is we can now give full-size databases, which eliminates bugs. code can be tested on the full size and range of data. StubHub estimated that they eliminated 20% of the bugs that they previously had seen in production. And the fifth point is self-service is now fast, efficient, and build a culture of yes. So it's a review of what we've seen: efficient QA, low cost, high utilization, quick QA for fast bug fixes. Every developer gets a database copy, parallelizing development. They use full database copies, so we find less bugs than in production, and fast builds, leading to fast development projects and a culture of yes. Some examples: Macy's went from 4,000 hours a year of cloning databases down to 8 hours a year with using Delphix. KLA 10 Core over doubled their project output, which was like taking a 100-person development team and making a 200-person development team. Health Dialog reduced the storage from 720 terabytes, which is almost a petabyte, down to 8 terabytes of storage.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm sure that everyone will agree the opportunities with Delphix are very excited. The idea of spinning up the database very quickly, it's very exciting. And for doing so, we also need to make sure all other environments are under source control. Spinning up database cloning creates a different challenge when we want to merge changes. So the transition between development, test, staging, user acceptance test, and production is done by deploying containers or packages. Development needs methods and tools that will allow them to collect all approved changes in a container and promote the containers to the next environment. In addition, we need to find out any changes that were made and not part of the current container and not to include it. Of course, when we work in parallel, we need to merge changes before we promote changes and not override each other change and not reverting changes that are not coming from our environment. Building the container or packages have to be done automatically because we done it very often. DBmaestro helps you managing those containers with regards to the database world. So what is DBmaestro Teamwork? DBmaestro Teamwork is a solution that enables you to take control of your database development from the very beginning using version control best practices. It is integrated with your existing ALM solution you already have. All your change requests, tasks, ticketing, bugs, enhancements. All changes are stored in a version control repository which is connected to the impact analysis module. More than just a compare and sync tool. With automation in mind, you can complete your DevOps or continuous delivery or continuous deployment processes, and if there is a slight change that something should not be promoted or there is a conflict, DBmaestro Teamwork will make sure you know about it and will not automatically move the wrong code. The challenges that DBmaestro addresses that we've seen when we speak with customers are many delays in development, many silos in the organization, and even within the development team. Many organizations still miss the due date of releases. And of course, there are errors when promoting changes to production. Development delays. There are different methodologies when working on the application and database, although they are on the same team. Application use version control, use automated. With database, some of the organizations we talked with are still not managing any changes for their database object and still creating the Delta scripts manually. Code overrides. People tend to override each other code. Two developers working on the same package but different procedure. When they execute the create or replace, they override each other code. There is no history of changes, so we don't remember what we've done 6 months ago. And when we write manual Delta script, we have syntax error. We, of course, have database dependencies errors. Of course, when we are working in silos, everybody is looking for errors made by others. There is no any visibility, and of course there is no sharing between the team. This is what we call blame storming. And since we don't have automation, because we don't feel comfort on it, we don't confidence that the automation will actually promote changes that are correct and not just changes that exist in the database, we don't do it. And if we don't do it, we spend hours and hours in manual tasks, and of course we don't have time for do what we want to develop. And because we are just human and we don't have really automation, we have errors in production. We forget stuff. We have syntax error. And of course, some people don't really know that the reference data is also part of your database code. So in this in mind, I would like to ask you a quick question and see which challenges you have experienced. So please vote. I'll be closing the poll in 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1, closing the poll. And as you can see, the results of the poll are very exciting. More than 65% reports on delays in deployment, 62% errors in production, and 46% have development delays and silos in the team, which of course this is something that we don't want to have. So how DBmaestro Teamwork will help you? With a database version control that enforces checkout, check-in in the database object, doing labels, doing all the best practices for version control activities, you have audit trail reports, you can know who did what, when, where, and why. A database impact analysis that is plugged in with the version control, utilize all the information that we have, give you a very good deployment tool. Using the three-way analysis with baseline, give you the information, is this something that you want to promote? And of course, automation, required API, required baseline, conflict resolution. And DBmaestro Teamwork helps you to insert your business logic to the deploy script, which is very important when you want to execute script automatically. For example, when you change column from null to not null, and you need your business logic to handle all null values before executing the DDL. Without DCM, the common process of development consists of two isolated processes. At the left, you can see the version control process. I have scripts which simulate the database objects. So I check out the script, I modify it. Once I modify it in an editor, I then need to debug it. So I compile the script in the database, I debug the script in the database, recompile until it passed my unit test. At this time, the script that I started with and the script that I have right now, the database object, are different. So I need to update the script from the database and check in it back to the repository. But since these are two isolated processes, one can forget to do one of these arrows, one of these transitions. One can work directly on the database without updating the version control repository. One can work on the version control process and not check the database, or check the database and not update the script from the database. Our goal is to have single enforced process like we have in application development. You check out an object in the database, you modify the object directly in the database, you run your test, and when you're done, you check in the objects that exist in the database into the repository. No scripts in the middle should be updated. And with baseline, you have a safety net for your automation deployment. When you just run a compare and sync between two environments, you have two results, as you can see at the table of the left. But when you use baseline and you compare three-way analysis, you have now 4 results, which give you more information on the native of the change, and if it is something that you want to promote or override the target to be like the source, or is it this change you want to ignore because it was made from a different environment, or there is a conflict in this object. And of course, we will see all of this in the demo very soon. So the benefits for the development. We have a database change repository that documents all changes. We follow the SCM best practices, check out, check in, labels, view history. We can manage who can do what, where, when, and why. For the operation team, we have integrated deployment engine that utilize the information from the repository. We don't need to maintain 2 scripts, one for the create table and one for the altering table. The deployment module will generate a DDL for us. We have a business level audit reports, which we can see all changes that have been made to the environment in a given time frame. And roles and responsibilities enforcement. In many organizations, the same Oracle user is shared between many developers or many DBAs. With DBmaestro, we can add another layer of permission on top of Oracle and give you more information of who really execute this change, or even prevent people from changing objects in Oracle. For the management point of view, we have a complete visibility into changes in progress. We have reports. No more silos in the organization because everything is visible. No needs to blame storming each other. So with this in mind, what Kyle and I would like to show you is how both solutions works together. We will do a live demo in which Kyle will clone 2 virtual copies of a trunk environment to dev1, dev2. Then we will make changes and merge them into the trunk. Developer 1 will modify dev1 and then merge it to the trunk environment. Developer 2 will modify dev2, maybe the same objects, maybe different objects, and merge these environments to the trunk, while we hope not revert changes being made in dev1. And we will rely on enforced changes, automation, of course, in order to be more agile. So Kyle, I will switch to you, that you can start with cloning the environment.
Okay. Okay, here you should see the Delphix interface. So I'm going to log in. And the important part here is in the top left, I have a black dot with an S in it. This is the source database or production database. So Delphix is pulling in changes from the source database, and we can create virtual database copies of it. So I have an existing trunk copy where we are doing development work and merging in the changes. I'm going to make 2 copies of this, one for developer 1 and one for developer 2, where each of those developers can independently make changes. So on the bottom right, there's a provision button, which will make a virtual database copy of the trunk database. First thing I do is I'm going to click on this machine I want this new instance to run on. It's a source machine, and then I'll name the database developer 1. And hit next. There is a couple of groups. One is for security, who's allowed to make copies of this database, and snapshot policy, because these virtual databases will also be snapshotted and kept in a time window will be kept for them as well. And then finish. So it takes around 2 minutes to create a virtual database. We can see the timeline running. It's 13% right now. I'm going to create a second copy of trunk for a second developer. So again, I hit the provision button on the top, on the bottom right. Going to name this one developer 2, dev 2. Start the instance on the same machine, the source machine. Take the defaults and finish. Now, one question that comes up when we introduce Delphix to customers is, if each developer has their own copy of the production database and they're making their own changes, how do we merge those changes back together again into, say, the trunk? And Delphix doesn't handle that, and that's where a tool like a company like DBmaestro comes in, because with DBmaestro's tools, we can manage and merge those changes. So right now I have the 2 virtual databases being provisioned. Again, it takes about a couple of minutes. Delphix handles all the busy work, all the important work in the background, such as sharing the file system from Delphix, mounting it over NFS to the machine that's going to run the Oracle instance, starting up that Oracle instance, changing the database's name, setting up its init.org parameters, recovering the database, and opening up the database. And then just a few things while that is executing. We can manage users. I clicked on manage users. We have a list of users here. I only have the admin and a developer, but I can add developer 1, developer 2, which will allow those developers to create their own clone copies themselves. We can restrict which databases they have access to. We can restrict how many copies they can make. So the first virtual database is made. The second one is still running. We can also manage policies. I'll click on Manage Policies. Here we say how long, we can set the time windows for how long we want to keep a time window for each database. By default, it's 2 weeks, which means I can spin up a clone copy of that database anywhere from within that 2-week time period. So if something went wrong yesterday and we didn't find out till today, I can go spin up a copy when that problem occurred and investigate that problem. So second database is almost finished. And now it's finished. I'll pass it back, and we can use DBmaestro's tools to manage the changes and merge the changes back into trunk.
Okay, thank you, Carl. So once you created your clone, I just create this schema and register them to DBmaestro Teamwork. As we can see, we have the trunk, we have the dev1 and dev2 environment. This is the DBmaestro Management Studio, but what I will want to show you is working with the Oracle SQL Developer, which I guess most of you know, which have the dev and the trunk environment. And from here, I want to make some changes. So let's start making some changes in the dev1 environment. I'll start add a new column to table department, address. Oops, I'm getting an error. Table departments is checked in and cannot be modified. Please check out. This comes from the Oracle DBmaestro Teamwork Policy Enforcement, which means I cannot modify an object unless I check out it in DBmaestro. Of course, this error will get regardless of which Oracle client I'm using, even if I'm using SQL plus command line. So what I need to do, I need to right-click on the object, and you can see here the icon of the object, which represents the icon is being locked. I will check out it, and you can see that the object is now open for me. So now when the object is open, I can add my new column. So here it is, the new column exists in the database, but I didn't check in the object yet. it is in the database. I can compare the history of all objects, the objects, to what exists in the repository, and I can see that the change is the new column that I've just added. So with this in mind, I have two options: to check in my change or undo it or continue developing. But I want to check in my change, so I'm writing a comment, adding a new column. And because it's very important in the Agile and DevOps to know the reason for the change, Teamwork is plugged into your ALM, into your change management system. So you can populate your work item, your task, your user stories, and Teamwork will display this list in the change set combo box, drop-down box. Let's say that this is part of the update department wizard. At this time, DBmaestro Teamwork goes to the Oracle, retrieve the metadata of the object, and stored it back in our repository. So let's make another change in the table jobs. Let's create a new index on job title. That's it. And of course, we can compare the change before we do check-in. We can see the new index exists in the database, but not in the repository. So we will add a new comment, add new index, and this is part of the performance improvement task. Teamwork also allows you to manage your business logic code, which is in your procedure, packages, function. Let's change this procedure to be Friday and Saturday, compile it. We can of course see all the changes in the version history. We can see the change between the days. And we can check in the object, which in this case, in this point of time, we declare that the code is okay. We passed unit test. All changes that are not in the version control repository will not be considered when we promote changes forward. So this is code changes. The reason for this is bug 110. Now, Teamwork also allows you to manage content of your reference data, your lookup content, lookup tables. You can see the table countries and location as a yellow background. This means that if I'll go to table countries and click on the data and try to add a new country, I will get an error saying country's content is checked in and cannot be modified. Please check out. By default, DBmaestro Teamwork just manages the structure of the table, not the content. It is up to you to tell Teamwork this table is a reference table and it's static. There is no application that manages the content of there is no application that changes the content of this table. So let's make some changes in the location code. Let's change the postal code of location ID 1300 from 6823 to 6656 and commit. Again, we can go to the history, compare our changes, and we can see the change itself. So after review the change, we want to check in the content change into the repository. In this time, when we check in the content, DBmaestro Teamwork retrieved the content of the table and stored it in the repository. So once we set up with all our changes, we want to promote it to the integration environment. With this in mind, we want to execute some scripts or some code that we've written. So let's promote changes from dev1 into integration. So the first thing that we do, like when we build our application, we label our schema in the repository. Then we label the trunk before we make changes. Then we ask Teamwork to generate the deploy script for us in order to know which changes. Because we didn't maintain any list or any scripts of all our changes. We work directly in the database. So DBmaestro Teamwork manage all the changes in its repository, and when we ask to generate a script, it generates the script that we asked for. If we click on the dev1 schema, we can see the history, and we can see the version, the label, all the objects that are part of this label. We can, of course, create the script of this label. After the script is being generated, we entered into integration mode in DBmaestro for our trunk environment in order to be able to execute the script DBmaestro just generated. And then we exit the integration mode. When we exiting the integration mode, DBmaestro Teamwork identifies which objects were changed and mark them as checked out. It doesn't really change the object because the script already changed the object. And then we can check in the changes and label the trunk after we promote our changes. So if we go to the trunk environment, we can see the history before dev1 and after dev1, and we can compare the two labels between each other and see which objects have differences. Table departments, which we add a new column, table jobs, which we add a new index, the secure DML procedure, and the location code, the content of the location code. So this was easy. We take one environment, make some changes, promote it to the trunk. So now let's switch hats and let's be the developer 2. So we are now in the developer 2 environment. Let's make some changes to the secure DML procedure. But this time I want to change the hour. I want to start working late, not at 8 a.m. but 9 a.m. and add some escalation mark in the string. And I can compare my code to the database. I can see my changes. Hour 8 become 9 and new escalation marks. And I can, of course, check in the change, write a comment, code changes, and select the reason, bug 110. Let's make some changes to the content of the location code table. But this time let's change the postal code of location ID 1600 and add 1 at the end. Let's do more changes and delete location ID 3200. And I want to add a new location ID 5000. The address will be New York. Postal code will be, city will be New York. States will be New York. Country, New York. Country, US. And check in. So I've made the changes. I can, of course, see the history and compare my changes that are currently in the database. I debug my application, see that it works, and I can see all the changes I've made. I changed the postal code of location ID 1600. I added a new location ID 5000 and delete location ID 3200. So let's check in my changes. And while we just create this clone, my colleague, Eli, start working on this table employees. Now I just want to add this table and modify it a little bit. So let's drop this column commission PCT that I don't need anymore and clicking on OK, and I get a strange error. Table employees is checked out by Eli and cannot be modified by Uri. Wow. DBmaestro teamwork policy enforced prevents from two developers working on the same object at the same given time. We prevent code overwrites. So if people want to work on the same object, they need to clone the database or wait while the other complete, or just ask his colleague, please check in his change. Now Eli didn't come to work, he started working and then disappeared, and I still need to complete the version. So I have two options. I can ignore his changes, or I can call him and say, what have you done? Oh, we need it into the release. And if I have permission, I can force check in. Because all changes are already in the database, I don't need Eli's laptop. He already made the changes in the database. So I can check in the changes he already made and enter them into the repository. If we can compare between the two revisions, we can see the changes that Eli made. He changed the first name and last name into a full name column. And also create foreign keys. So I did check in, we complete all our development, and now we want to merge them back to the integration. So we will execute dev2 script. Again, we're doing labels on dev2. We're creating a label on dev2. We're creating a label on the integration before we create the changes. And we're generating the script to promote changes that we made in dev2 to the trunk. But we know that there are some conflicts in our changes. Usually when you do stuff automatically, you don't really know if there is a conflict or not. You just rely on the automation. And you want the automation to alert you if there are any conflicts. And as you can see, there was an error generating the deploy script. So if we go and see the error log, we can see that the generation of script was aborted on conflict according to the first policy. You can of course ask Teamwork to ignore conflicts or override the conflict. But the safest way is, if there is a conflict, abort the automation, and then what we need is to start the deployment using our UI. So we open the deployment manager, selecting our schema, selecting the labels that we've just created, selecting all objects, selecting our target environment, which is the trunk, and ask Teamwork to analyze. Of course, now the baseline is very important. As we've seen in the automation, it breaks the generation of the script because there is a conflict. And we want an easy way to see if there is a conflict. We can see that there are some changes in the objects, table departments, employees, jobs, and procedure secure DML. With the baseline in mind, and baseline is when we clone the trunk to dev1 and dev2, we can see the origin of the change. Table departments has been changed in the target, but not in our environment. Also table jobs. This means that someone else changed these objects in the trunk. Teamwork recommends you to ignore this change, not override it. If we just drill down to the change to see the changes themselves, we can see all the object definition from all three environments, from the source, from the baseline, and from the target. And of course, we can see that in the target, the address column exists, but it doesn't exist in the baseline and doesn't exist in the source. If we didn't have the baseline if we don't consider the baseline, and we just ask the target to be like the source, any simple compare and sync tool will generate the alter table drop column command, which of course we now know we don't need it. Someone else add the address column in the target. This is why Teamwork recommends to ignore the change. Same goes to the table jobs. Table employees we just changed. Teamwork recommends to override the change. And look on the secure DML procedure. Teamwork identified that this object was changed between all environments, and it asks you to merge the conflict. So we can see all changes, all the objects, and we can see the code in the source, in the baseline, and in the target. Like any version control that allows you working in parallel, you can ask to merge between the code, or like Word, track changes in Word, accept or reject. And in the bottom, we can see the merge code. We can see the arrow 9 comes from the source. Days, Friday and Saturdays, comes from the target. And escalation marks come again from the source. It's very easy to identify the changes and merge them when you merge changes between environment. Of course, the same goes to the content of your static table, the location codes table. This time, Teamwork will drill down into the row level and show you all the changes. Now, something strange happens here. We can see changes for location ID 1300, 1600, 5000, and 3200. From some reason, Teamwork selected automatically changes for location ID 1600, 5000, and 3200, and ignored changes for 1300. The reason is, again, because we have the baseline. If we examine the postal code of location ID 1300, we can see that the change origin from the target, source, and baseline are the same, meaning someone else already changed the target environment. We don't want to revert the value from 6656 to 6823. It's not the correct value. So with this, I can generate the script, the entire script, review it, and then I can save it to a file and continue my deployment. Now, something that is unique to DBmaestro Teamwork is our way to allow you to integrate your business logic to our deployment script. We mentioned before that a column that was null changed to not null. Before modifying the column from null to not null, we first need to make sure the column doesn't have null values. And this is where you can add your business logic, and we will embed it into our deployment script. And of course, now that I can save it to my folder, I can continue and execute the script into the trunk. So, Kyle, do you want to say?
Yeah, so just to review, part of what we did is we took the Delphix server, which is on the bottom left, which has been linked to a source database, and that source database we have the initial one-time only copy, and then we pulled in the changes From that source database in Delphix, we spun up a trunk copy of that source database. And this trunk is going to be where we merged our development changes. From the trunk, we allocated 2 virtual databases, one for developer 1, one for developer 2. Each of those developers can work on their own as fast as they want, and then we can use DBmaestro's teamwork tool to manage those changes and merge them into the trunk sort virtual database. The next slide will have a bit more detailed graphic showing what's actually happening here.
Yes, as Kyle mentioned, we cloned the development environment. We make some changes. We merge them back to the trunk, and we can continue our development environment on our sandbox environment, and then we want to merge them back again. So the conflict, the merges, it's much more complex environment when you work in parallel, and you need to merge changes back from the trunk to dev1 or dev2 to trunk and going backward, and have all the developers being synchronized with all changes from their colleague. Now, of course, the same goes if you have a fork that you want to test your changes before going to the trunk. So you make changes in dev1, merge them to the fork, run QA. If QA pass, then you promote them to the trunk. If QA fail, you continue your changes. And then dev2 does the same on its own time. And then we need to go back and reflect changes that from the trunk to dev1 to continue our development.
Yeah, so this is where the 2 products worked marvelously together. So we've already allocated the virtual databases for developer 1 and developer 2. But typically before merging changes into a trunk, we want to make sure those changes are correct. So it's just a few minutes, almost no storage, to fork a copy of trunk, merge in our changes, run a QA suite, verify it, and at that point, we can be assured to safely merge those changes back into trunk. And it takes the combination of the 2 products from Delphix and DBmaestro to achieve this easily and powerfully.
Okay, so now it's time for Q&A, and we already have some questions in the pipe. Kyle, the first question is for you. How much time does it take to implement Delphix, from setup to getting the first VDB?
So, yeah, it's a great question. So, provided that we have the hardware in place that we're required, so we have a Intel machine and storage, it takes about 5 minutes to install the Delphix software into a virtual machine. It takes another 5 minutes to go through the web interface to set up Delphix. At that point, we can register a source database with Delphix, and the longest step in the process will be the initial linking with the source database, which only happens once. It never happens again. For a small database, this could be a few minutes. For a 50 terabyte database, it might be 2, 3, 4 days, depending on the pipe bandwidth between Delphix and the source database. And then once that's done, we can spin up virtual databases as many as you want within a few minutes each for very little storage overhead.
Okay. Second question. Does virtualization support schema changes? Is it likely that schema changes would require considerably more storage?
On the virtual databases, the storage, So on the virtual databases, the storage constraints depend on how many data blocks are changed. So generally, schema change depends on the schema change. Adding a constraint might be practically no storage overhead. Doing some sort of schema change that required a modification to each data block could require a lot of changes. One thing to keep in mind is that if we change, say, 300 gigabytes of data, it's automatically compressed on Delphix, so that'd be 1/3 of the changes, so 100 gigabytes on Delphix.
Okay. And another question for you, Kyle. How does Delphix maintain updates between IT and cloned copies? Is there a sync between updated copies, original DB, and clones? Is there any latency?
As I think I understand the question, I interpret it as this. When I have a virtual database, is that virtual database continuing to receive changes from the source? And no, it is not. Once I spin up a virtual database, it's a separate entity that no longer sees changes from the source database. If we wanted something like that, we could combine it with, say, DB Visit or Golden Gate, which would stream in changes to the virtual database after the virtual database was created from the source database.
Okay. Is there any latency? How does this affect nightly administration processes? Do you have to be on the DB administrator to have any access?
So access to the virtual databases is the same access you would have to a Oracle database. So you'd have to have credentials to log in as sys or system. We have post-provisioning scripts which you can change the passwords to sys, system, or any other user such that they're not the same as the source database. As far as latency, I assume, is the question about if I'm running a virtual database, what's the performance in the virtual database compared to production? It can be faster or slower depending on the infrastructure. If we have slower disks than the production database, then the I/O off those disks will be slower and therefore performance will be slower. Delphix also offers the capability of caching, having like a read cache on the Delphix virtual machine. One thing also amazing about this is if I have 10 virtual databases from the same source, so there are 10 copies of the same database, once one of those virtual databases caches data in memory in the cache on Delphix, it is now available in cache for all those other 9 copies of the same database. So we can see some surprising performance improvements using virtual databases.
Okay, another question that comes here is, can you mask content from production when you clone copies?
So for masking or obfuscating data from production, there are many tools on the market. Delphix integrates with any of them. Delphix provides the hook that when one provisions a virtual database as a post-provisioning script, any modifications or obfuscation can be hooked in with the tools that a customer is currently using. A second option, which is often used, is when we spin up a virtual database, we'll obfuscate one virtual database and then branch off all the other copies from the one that's already been obfuscated.
Okay, there is a question about if DBmaestro is additional cost item. Yes, DBmaestro is a different solution which integrates with Delphix solution, but they are licensed differently. There is another question for you, Kyle. Alter table move or alter index rebuild and similar would not likely to be a very good idea on a virtual DB. How do you handle it?
So I think we should take a step back. Database virtualization allows incredible efficiency improvements. So if I want to spin up a database, it takes me about 2 minutes. Now, if I do operations that take up more storage on that virtual database, they'll be like any database. They'll take up more storage. But the improvement is the speed. I can allocate environments in minutes. I can allocate parallel QA environments in minutes for almost no storage overhead. Those databases will require their own storage if we add data or modify data. But one thing that's actually sort of cool is those modifications are automatically compressed by 1/3. Storage is really, I say, icing on the cake. If we save storage, that's great. The mind-blowing thing is the speed. Instead of taking like one global bank saying they take 6 months to provide a database copy, with Delphix, it's a matter of minutes.
Okay. Question for me, how much time it takes to implement DBmaestro? DBmaestro Teamwork, it takes about 3 days to implement. Most of these 3 days are considering which object, which schema, creating the project tree, then showing the team, and start adding objects to Teamwork Control. At this time, all development start working with DBmaestro checkout, check-in, and it's very common UI and common practices that they work as they go with their application development. Another question, who use DBmaestro? Is it the developers or the DBAs? Well, both. Developers do changes in their development environments. DBA can review the changes, can make the deploy scripts, and of course DBAs are the one that actually execute it when we go to production or even user acceptance test. Can DBmaestro prevent changes from all IDEs or just the IDE you showed? DBmaestro Teamwork change policy enforcement is embedded within the database engine. So regardless which Oracle IDE you work, you cannot modify the object unless you first check out it. We just released our integration with the Oracle SQL developer, and we work with Oracle Corporation that they expose us the API in order to make the life of the developer and DBA much more easier. From the same working environment, they can check out, check in, view history, compare, so they don't need to switch between the application. They can do all the changes, all their day-to-day operation from the same single UI. But if someone who is logging to Oracle using the SQL plus command line and it didn't check out the object, it will get the same error. Okay, Kyle, a question for you. If my source database is TDE, transparent data encryption, will Delphix be able to clone the database? Does Delphix support TDE?
Delphix creates a copy of the Oracle database exactly like the source database. So if you're using encryption on the source database, you'll get encryption on the virtual database. Should be transparent.
Okay, I think we complete all our questions. I want to thank you all for being in our webinar. I hope you had a great time. Of course, we will upload the recording soon, and we will send you email so you can just go and listen for it on your free time. Thanks you, everyone.
For joining. Thanks, Yuri.
Thanks, Kyle. It was a pleasure.
For me as well.